English or Hebrew? עברית? Anyone does not speak Hebrew? So עברית. מצוין. אז אנחנו מאוד שמחים להעריך את אייל רונן, קולוקביום. אייל למד תואר ראשון בטכניון, תואר שני בהנדסת חשמל כאן, אחרי זה הוא חזר לצבא, או תוך כדי הצבא, אחרי שהוא השתחרר הוא עשה דוקטורט עם עדי שמיר בוויצמן, בוויצמן הוא קיבל את הג'ון אף קנדי פרייס, זה הפרייס הכי נחשב לתלמידי דוקטורט בוויצמן, וגם
המון שטויות.
עוד נושאים, נכון? שהתעשייה מעריכה תרומה של אקדמיה לקריפטוגרפיה או סקיוריטי. כרגע היה לו פוסט-דוק כאן ובלובן, נכון?
בו-זמנית. סופר פוזיציה. יש שניים. אנחנו יותר טובים.
זהו.
טוב, I'll speak in English. מה שבא לי. Okay. I'll try it in English and then maybe change my mind. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. And my name is Eyal. And what I want to talk about today is breaking and fixing real-world crypto. And by real-world crypto, I mean the actual cryptographic implementations that we all use in our daily lives. And when I talk about breaking and fixing, maybe another way to say it is how to analyze the security and how to design cryptographic implementation or secure systems in general. And there is a problem in doing it, and the problem is that we're talking about very, very complex systems. And we need to find a way to analyze and prove different security guarantees that are also becoming more and more complex during the time. And there's a question, how can we do it? And the simple answer is like everybody else, and we're going to do it in layers. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to try to model the cryptographic implementations in different layers. And we can start with the lowest layer, which is the hardware layer. And for example, we might want to design a secure smart card that is able to store cryptographic keys in a way that we're not able to extract them, even if we have physical access and quite a lot of capabilities as an attacker. And another thing is we might want to try to design the computers that we run crypto on in a safe way that they might protect different computation. For example, there are secure enclaves like SGX that are supposed to protect the computation even if the operating system is malicious. There are a lot of recent attacks like in the speculative execution type of attacks like Spectre and Meltdown that we also want to be able to protect against this type of attacks and basically have a secure hardware. And then after we do the best that we can do in this field, what we're going to do is we're going to abstract it. And we're going to assume that we have some ideal hardware. It can, for example, store keys securely. And in other ways, it might run as like an ideal Turing machine. And then we're going to try and design cryptographic primitives. Cryptographic primitives might be ones that are based on different mathematical hardness assumptions like RSA, or might be simple relatively complex creatures that what we can say about them, for example, this is AES, that we tried for a really, really long time to break them, and so far we weren't successful, so we assume that they are secure. And this is done using what you call cryptoanalytic techniques. It's a very old methodology. It started in the 19th century, and so far it had a lot of success, but we feel that today we are relatively good at designing this type of primitives, and even do it relatively efficient, so they can run fast and be cheap to implement. So after we've done our best work, we're going to again abstract this, and we're going to assume that we have ideal cryptographic primitives. Sometimes in cryptography, for example, we don't like to talk about hash functions. We rather talk about random oracles, and we want to talk about block ciphers, about ideal permutations. And then we can use these primitives and try to implement more complex cryptographic protocols. For example, TLS that is used to encrypt data between clients and servers on the internet. And then we're trying to prove the security guarantees of these cryptographic protocols. We have a lot of different methodologies how to do it. In Tel Aviv, universal composability is probably well known. There are other formal methods that can be done. And in the end, we're going to have this complex state machine that we hope that we'll be able to prove that it provides the security guarantees that we want to have. And then we can say we have these ideal cryptographic protocols, and we can go to the upper layer. We can call it the application layer, or the cyber layer, or the buzzword layer. But in the end, we're going to try at least to prove that we can protect the user's bank accounts or really concrete data. And this is a relatively nice approach. It's much, much better than everything we used to do maybe in the 90s or something, when we just try to provide primitives and protocols and hope that they will be okay. Things are much better now, but this still has several problems. And the main one is that when we talk about real-world cryptography, we don't have any abstract and ideal layers. We have concrete protocols that use specific cryptographic primitives on specific hardware. And there's actually a very complex interaction between those different layers. And in this interaction between those layers, we might find a lot of different vulnerabilities that actually break the security guarantees that we want to have. And what I want to mainly talk about today is something that lies in this interaction, which is called side channel attacks. And maybe a simple definition, or relatively simple definition, or simplified definition of side channel attacks is that we're going to have some kind of variability in the way that the cryptographic implementation is executed, and this variability is going to be correlated with some secret values that we want to protect. It might be keys, it might be data, but it's something that it's supposed to be secure. And we have a lot of different types of attackers that are relevant to different types of side channel attacks. And we can try to model our attackers as an attacker that may be able to detect different error messages that arise from the system when different fault occurs. The attacker might be able to record or measure the running time of the algorithm. More advanced attacker might be able to detect when specific locations in memories are accessed. And again, if this might lead to vulnerabilities in the implementation, and I'm going to try to give several examples. So let's assume that we want to implement a very secure cryptographic protocol or primitive. And now part of our code is going to be this line that checks if a secret value is equal to 0 or not. And then if it's 0, then it's an error. It's going to send an error message saying this is a bad secret value. Now, if an attacker is able to measure those or detect those error messages, he learns information about the secret value. Another option, for example, might be that we're going to test a specific secret key bit, and if it's 1, we're going to run a very, very slow function. Otherwise, if it's 0, we're going to run a very, very fast function. And here again, if an attacker is able to measure the running time, he might learn information about the secret key bit. Another option is that we're going to take a secret key byte, and we're going to use it as an index in a very large table in memory. And again, an attacker that is able to detect different access patterns might be able to learn this key byte and recover secret information. Now, this looks like relatively stupid toy examples, but actually, the first example has been implemented in the SSL protocol that was used in the past for HTTPS communication. The second one is still a relatively common way to calculate exponentiations for RSA or Diffie-Hellman cryptography. And the last example is still the way that we usually implement software AES, which is the currently most popular block cipher. So this is something that really happens in practice. And the question is, why do we have this type of implementations? And the first thing that we need to understand when we're talking about side channel attacks mitigation is that it's very hard to model the attacker that we're going to have and understand what type of attack is going to happen. And the problem is that we need to be able in some way to predict novel attacks that might be only invented a few years from now, and different weird usage scenarios that we don't know about when we try to design it. The problem is that some of these cryptographic protocols or primitives are going to still be used in about 20 or 30 years from now. We know it because we still have 30-year-old cryptography that is currently being used. And if we want to mitigate this type of side channels, it's actually something that's going to be very, very hard to do. And the main problem, basically, is the way that the cryptographic primitives and protocols that we currently use were designed in the past. And they were designed in a way that simply was not aware of this type of attacks. And they actually are very, very hard to implement without those side channels. And it usually results in very, very complex code with severe performance penalties. And to do it correctly, we need to understand this different interaction between the abstraction layers, also in software. And we usually need to break different abstraction layers, which is something that programmers really don't like to do. And sometimes we actually need to use dedicated and very costly hardware to mitigate some of those side channels. So we don't want to pay that much. So sometimes we might try to do some trade-off between what I call the information theoretical approach, which basically means we need to block all side channels. There will be no variability that is correlated in any way to secret values, or the computational approach that says that there might be some correlation, some data might leak in an information theoretical manner, but it will be too complex to try to recover anything meaningful out of it. It might be computationally hard, or simply there will be no known algorithm how to do it. And the problem is, again, when we look at how to actually break this real-world crypto, we can use a lot of different approaches that actually are actually aware of this type of interactions. And we're going to try to attack this implementations on all of the different layers. Usually, when we try to attack modern and more secure implementations, we need to look at the protocol layer. We need to try to think if there are any cases or if there are any cases that might lead to weird consequences that were not thought of by the designers. We might use different cryptoanalytic techniques to try to recover some mathematical properties of the crypto primitives that might not be used when we look at the cryptographic primitive alone, but in combination with different side channels, for example, here is a power analysis, and the states that we can get the protocol to row it might still lead to breakage. And what I want to talk about today is several such examples. And I want to start to look at an example with a paper called Dragonfly. I need to apologize. All of these papers have really weird names. This is a mandatory requirement in the field. Otherwise, you can't publish anything. And here we're going to talk about Wi-Fi. Now, I don't think that Wi-Fi needs really an introduction here. I'm sure that some of you are using it right now. And basically, it has a very, very long and not very glorious history regarding to security. The first cryptographic protocol was designed in 1999. It was broken pretty much when it came out. And today, we have a much better alternative called WPA2. But it still has several severe problems. And I feel the most critical one is that by design, it is vulnerable to what we call offline password brute force attacks. And in this type of attacks, we're able to record several Wi-Fi messages. And then we're going to take this recording, and we're going to use very large password databases. And we're able to test if a specific password was used to encrypt those messages or not. And we can do it very efficiently, very cheaply, and we don't need any other interaction with the Wi-Fi devices themselves. And this basically means that unless you use a very unique and high entropy password, which most of the users don't do, the protocol is basically broken. And there were also several recent implementation attacks. Yes?
Password, you mean a username and user password to enter some kind of an account?
Yeah. Okay. In Wi-Fi, the username is called SSID, is the name of the network, which is public. It's been broadcast. And most users still keep the phone number that the basic technician put in place. This is not very high entropy. OK, so in response,
what is high entropy? What is low?
high entropy is something that you can't remember, basically. It's not, but most of the users choose very, very weak passwords. That's the basic point. So in response, the Wi-Fi Alliance, which is a very, very large consortium of companies that is responsible for the certification and standardization of Wi-Fi devices, rolled out a new protocol called WPA3. And WPA3 uses much more modern approach to cryptography. It uses something that's called password authenticated key exchange that uses a password with low entropy to negotiate a very, very high entropy key that can be used for encryption. And it's based on a specific protocol called Dragonfly. And this Dragonfly is a bit weird opaque. And it's weird because it was developed by a single person, which is an ex-NSA employee, that did it without any collaboration with any experts in the academy or in the industry. And for some reason, it got adopted as a standard. Not claiming anything about it. And it's currently been widely used, both in Wi-Fi and when you connect to the eduroam network, for example. It's also the protocol that's used for authentication there. And it does have claims for much, much better security. And specifically, it's supposed to prevent the possibility of offline dictionary attack. If I want to test if a specific password is used, I have to open a handshake with the Wi-Fi device itself. OK, so everything is fine, except it's not. And what we did in our paper, we did a comprehensive analysis of this protocol. And we were able to show the first attacks on WPA3 and Dragonfly. And in the end, we were basically able to break almost all of the security guarantees that were promised by this protocol and actually implement those attacks. And we can have proof of concept where we have a router and we're able to extract passwords. And maybe more importantly, in the end, we were able to give several recommendations that solve most of the root causes for those vulnerabilities. And they resulted in a new version of the protocol. It's currently under draft and hopefully will be implemented soon. So I claim that I have a lot of different attacks. So we need to understand what are those attacks that I'm talking about. And here we need to understand what are the attack scenarios that we are able to do. We have several scenarios. And the first one is that we are able to attack access points. Access points are the routers that we connect to for the Wi-Fi. I think that's basically this thing. And so here when we try to attack, we have a malicious client, basically something that is able to send Wi-Fi messages to the access point. And we're able to do, first of all, what we call a timing attack, which is when we time the responses of the access point, we're able to leak information about the password and recover the password that is used. We have what we call an invalid curve attack, which basically means that we're able to bypass the cryptographic protocol and connect to a network without knowing the password. And we have a denial of service attack, which means that even if we use very cheap hardware, like maybe a Raspberry Pi, we're able to cause even industrial-grade routers to stop responding at all. We're also able to attack the clients. And the clients have similar attacks. We're able to do the same timing and invalid curves on the client. The client might be a laptop or a smartphone. And if we are able to block Wi-Fi messages, which is something relatively simple, we only need to block the CRC bytes that are sent in the end of each message or each packet, we're able to do what we call a downgrade attack. In a downgrade attack, if we have a client and access points that both support the new WPA3 protocol, we're able to cause them to downgrade and use the older WPA2 protocol, and then we can use the known vulnerabilities to attack it. Okay, the last scenario is what we call a cache attack scenario. And here we have a stronger adversarial model, and we assume that we're able to run our own malicious code on the client. Although this code does not have any special privileges, it runs in user mode. So for example, it might be a malicious app you downloaded on your phone without any permissions, or some application you installed on your laptop. And we use this code to try to measure microarchitectural side channels, or the way that the cache is used. And this again leaks information about the password. Okay, so this is the text scenario. This is very nice. And now I'm going to try to explain how some of those attacks works. And to do it, we need to understand some details about the Dragonfly protocol itself. So this is the Dragonfly protocol. There's a lot of cryptographic calculation, several hash, some calculation of points. But basically, what we need to know about it is that it uses something that's very similar to Diffie-Hellman key exchange, but it's based on a secret group element, a P, and this secret group element is used to negotiate secret session keys. Now, WPA3 supports two types of cryptographic groups. Both of those groups, we assume that the discrete log problem is hard. And it's either mod P groups or the elliptic curve group, which are much more efficient, much more interesting, and this is what we're going to talk about. And it seems to be OK. There are a lot of things I don't like about this protocol, but I don't have any concrete attacks on this negotiation. But we ask ourselves, how is it used inside WPA3 or in Wi-Fi? And more specifically, how is this secret group element P is derived from a password? So we need a little bit background on elliptic curves. So elliptic curves are mathematical groups where each element is denoted by two coordinates, x and y. X and y are in some prime field, and they hold the curve equation. And we need to find a way to convert a password, which is a byte string, to some xy coordinate that lies on this curve. And the way that this is done in Dragonfly is using an interesting construction called Hash2 Curve. And Hash2 Curve is a hash function that provides what we call random oracle mapping, which maps any arbitrary string into a point on the curves that looks random, and there's that basically looks random. And the interesting property that it has is that if we try to calculate the Hash2 Curve of two strings, we have no information about the discrete log between those 2 points, or between any of those points and any fixed point that we have on the curve. And this is actually very important for the security of the Dragonfly protocol, but it is a bit complex to implement. We're going to talk about it. And the way that this Hash2 Curve function was defined for WP3 is we're going to do hash the password and the MAC addresses of both parties that are involved in the protocol. OK, so how is it implemented in WP3? It's by using an algorithm called hunting and pecking. And this is a simplified version of the protocol. And here what we have is we have a hash of the password and both MAC addresses. And we use this value as the x coordinate of the point. And now we can calculate the value of y squared that corresponds to x. And now all we need to do is to check if this y square has a square root on this prime field or not. And if so, we're going to return the x and calculated y coordinates. The problem is that on basically any prime field, only half of the points are on the curve, so only half of the y square values have are quadratic residue. So how can we solve this? And we do it by basically adding a counter. So we're going to also hash a counter value, and we're going to iterate over different values until the first valid point is found. OK, so this solves the problem. But yes?
You know the distribution of the square roots in
I think it's supposed to be relative. It's 50-50. So,
no, that you know.
Oh.
I mean, the distances between
OK, this is basically a random oracle, so we generate a random point each time. So after 40 trials, there will be a 2 to the minus 40 probability that we don't find anything.
You assume complete independence?
Yes. Yes. For SHA-256, then, yeah, we can assume it. OK, so this is a nice solution, but there is a problem. And the problem is that the exact number of iterations that is required is dependent on this secret password and on the MAC addresses that are publicly known. So with this actually leaks information about the password. So what we can do, if we have a way to measure the number of iterations that are needed to find the first valid point, we can take the large password dictionary that we have. We're going to pre-compute how many iterations will be required for each MAC address that we use. And then we can prune any password that doesn't have the same number of iterations. And now in Wi-Fi, what we can do is it's very easy to spoof the MAC or change the MAC address. So we can change our own MAC address, and we can rerun the protocol, leaking more and more information about the password. So now we have another MAC address, we can pull more passwords, and in the end, if we have the right password in the dictionary, it will be the only one that is left. And this basically means that the number of iterations is a unique signature of the password that's being used. So the people that designed this protocol were aware of this. So they tried to implement several mitigations against this type of attacks. And the first mitigation is that we're not going to stop when the first point was found. We're going to just store the correct value in some variable, and we're going to continue doing the whole 40 iterations in any case. And moreover, after we find the first valid point, we're going to generate a random password, and all of the extra iterations are going to be run using this random password, which is supposed to add some kind of noise to the process. And moreover, this test, which is actually a bit complex to implement, is done in the most secure way that we know of. It's called the blended constant time. It basically means that it's resilient to any known timing or microarchitectural attacks. So we are supposed to be secure. The question, are we safe, is of course no, because otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it. But to understand why not, we need to look at some more details. So I mentioned before that we're going to use the result of the hash value as the X coordinate. But the problem is that the hash value is some fixed number of bits, and X is supposed to be inside some prime field. So how can we make sure that X is in the prime field? What we're going to do is we're going to actually truncate the resulting X value to the exact bit size of the prime that we use. OK, so does it solve the problem? Now we need to look at the concrete primes that are used in different curves that are implemented in the protocol. And for example, for the NIST 256 curve, we have a prime which is supposed to be very close to a Mersenne prime, which means it's very close to a power of 2. So the possibility that we'll still have a X value that is larger than a prime is negligible. However, for the brainpool curve family, we have primes that are farther away from power of 2. And there we have actually a very high probability that the resulting value is still going to be outside the prime field. And the way that this is solved in the protocol is by rejection sampling. Basically, we're going to check if the X value is too large, and if so, we're going to try again. The problem is that if we try again, we don't have any suggestion for Y square, so we can't run this code. And here we have a real variability in the time it takes to run a specific iteration. Now, the problem that we have now as an attacker is that the number of times that this calculation is skipped is dependent on the real password, but also on this random password that is generated, which changes each handshake. So we don't have any deterministic result that can tell us how many iterations were run. However, we can look at the distribution of the timing that we get, and this is actually dependent on the password. The variance that we have is dependent on when the first valid point was found. If we found the first, for example, the point on the first try, then we have 39 iterations that use random values. So we're going to have a very large variance. If we found the valid point in the last iteration, we're not going to have any variance at all. And the average amount of time is also dependent on the password. And this allows us to do what we call the timing attacks. And the timing attacks, what we're going to do is we're going to send the specific handshake message to the client or the access point and measure how much time it takes it to respond. And then we're going to draw this distribution. And there will be different distribution depending on different passwords. And what we show is that using a statistical test called the Crosby's box, which was developed for timing attacks, we need about 300 measurements to distinguish between those different distributions and actually leak the information about the password that we want to have. So this is nice, but as I told you before, the NIST curves are not vulnerable for this attack because they use a prime which is close to a power of 2. But we still want to be able to attack them. So here we need the other assumption of the microarchitectural attacks. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to detect in which iteration this code was run. So we're going to use a cache attack, which is called flash and reload, that enables to detect when a specific location in memory was accessed. And this specific location in memory is the assembly instruction that stores the result in this variable. Now, the problem is that this is going to happen almost on every handshake that we have. We need to know in which iteration it happens. So in parallel, we're going to monitor the call for this hash function, which gives us a kind of counter. And this, using those two attacks in parallel, we're supposed to learn which iteration was the first one that was successful. In practice, this is a little bit hard because those attacks are very noisy and very hard to implement. So what we're going to do is we're trying to leak just one bit of information if the first iteration was successful or not. And we use what we call a cache template attack. And basically, we're able to give a number for each measurement that we have. And we're going to have different distribution depending if the y-square value was quadratic residue or not. And again, we can show that using a relatively simple linear classifier, we need about 20 measurements to be able to leak this one bit of information. OK, so we are able to leak information both for the NIST curve and for the other curves. The question is this information useful? Basically, it means how hard is it to actually recover the password out of it. So what we did a complete probabilistic analysis that tells us how many different measurements or different MAC addresses do we need to detect the unique password for different sizes of password dictionaries, and what is the computational cost that is required, or how many calculations do we need for each of them. And then we implemented a very efficient GPU code that actually does this brute force attack. And we checked how much money it will cost on Amazon AWS instances to actually recover the password. And we see, for example, for this ever been pod password dictionary, which stores all of the passwords that ever been leaked on the internet, which are about 500 million different passwords, it will cost less than 2 cents to recover the password. And even if we have very, very large password domain space, it's still something that's quite reasonable. And actually, last year, I had a workshop here to implement some of those attacks with some students, and they found a way to do it much more efficiently. And I think this can be 2 or 3 orders of magnitude cheaper. OK. So we are able to show that we can recover password, and we have a lot of different attacks. The question is, as academic researchers, what do we do with this information, except to try to publish it? And what we do in these cases is what we call an ethical coordinate disclosure process, which basically means that we're going to contact, in this case, the Wi-Fi Alliance. We're going to work with them to try to fix all of those vulnerabilities and make things more secure. So we disclosed all of those findings. Basically, the protocol was rolled out in August 2018. And after a couple of months, we started the disclosure process with the first vulnerabilities that we found. And the hope was to try to fix things before WPS3 became widely adopted. And the first step was what we call backward compatible steps, which means we're going to help them fix the implementation to make it more secure. And the second step was to try to find and fix the root causes of those vulnerabilities. And what we recommended them was to change the rejection sampling that I mentioned to modular reduction calculation. And this actually induced negligible bias in the distribution of points that is generated, but it's something that doesn't have any real effect on security and solves a lot of other problems. We recommended them to remove the MAC addresses from the Hash2 Curve calculation and incorporate them in the later part of the protocol. This does not only make the things much more secure, but actually much more efficient, because now we don't need to run this 40 iteration each time we try to do a handshake with a client or access point. And in the end, we also recommended to change this hunting and pecking algorithm, which is a very simple but not very secure way to implement this Hash2 Curve, and use what we call a constant time approach, which is a more complex algorithm called SWU that actually is a constant time is not vulnerable to any side channel attacks. And this results in the new standard, which hopefully will be implemented much faster than the 15 years it took for the last one.
ההצעות למשל הראשונה, אמרת שהיא לא טריוויאלית, כלומר היא מכניסה איזשהו בייס, אבל הבייס הזה לא עוזר.
נכון.
איך הם בדקו את זה שאתם באמת, שהם לקחו את המילה שלכם, איך הם בדקו? ואם הם בדקו, למה הם לא בדקו את הפרוטוקול הראשון? אוקיי,
אני לא יודע לארגן בשום צורה על התהליך שהיה לפרוטוקול הראשון. הם הכניסו את ה-rejection sampling הזה בגלל שהם ידעו שזה מכניס בייסים ובייסים בקריפטו זה רע. אבל דוגמה, אני לא זוכר בדיוק מה הם עשו, אם אתה קח את הערך שלך, תוסיף עוד 30 ביט, תעשה על זה מודולל רידקשן, אתה יכול לחשב בדיוק כמה בייס שיוצא לך. גם אם אתה לא עושה את זה, אנחנו מדברים על מרחב בגודל של 2 ב-192.
אני לא שואל, לא מבקש שאתה תצדיק את ההצעה, אני שואל איך הם ידעו שההצעה היא מנימוק כזה, היו שם אנשים שיכלו להקשיב למה שאתה מסביר, או לקרוא את מה שאתה מסביר, ולהשתכנע, איך?
יכול להיות שהאמינו לי, אני חושב שאם אחרי זה הם הלכו וישאלו מישהו כלשהו, אז יגיד להם כן, ובטוויטר צחקו עליהם ואמרו שזה רעיון יותר טוב, אז כנראה שזה הספיק להם. אני לא יודע להגן בשום צורה על הדרך שהם עשו את הדיזיין או את התיקונים, אני כן יכול להגיד שהתיקונים האלה אני חושב שהם באמת נכונים. אין לי משהו אופטימי להגיד לך על התהליכים האלה. אוקיי, אז זה בקשר לווי-פיי, ואני רוצה לדבר איתכם על עוד מאמר, שעכשיו השם נקרא The 9 Lives of Bleichenbacher's Cat. ובמאמר הזה אנחנו תוקפים TLS. אפשר לחזור לאנגלית. TLS, or Transport Layer Security, is currently the most widely used cryptographic protocol in the world. This is what is used to protect the internet, basically, and also VPNs and a lot of other security mechanisms rely on TLS. And it has two main parts. The first one is the TLS handshake. TLS handshake is what allows us to authenticate the server that we communicate with. This is what tells us that we are actually talking to the Gmail server and not some phishing site. And it allows us to conduct the secure key exchange, basically resulting in a secure key that only the client and the server know. And then this secret key is used by the TLS record layer that actually encrypts the data for, in this example, the emails that are sent. And it supports a very interesting notion that we call cryptographic agility. And cryptographic agility means that we are able to support a lot of different cipher suites or a lot of different combinations of cryptographic primitives. And in theory, this allows us to deprecate older and more vulnerable cryptographic primitives and add new and better ones, at least in theory. And we're going to talk about this now. So what we're going to talk about here is what we call the RSA Key Exchange, cipher suite class. And this means that we're going to use RSA for the key exchange. And this was once the most popular TLS exchange option. Basically, 100% of the internet connection used it. But it has a very, very, very long history of practical implementation attacks. What I mean by practical implementation attacks, it means that people were able to recover secret keys. There were a lot of different rounds of fixing the implementation, fixing the crypto design, modification for the standard, and then again and again. So today we think we don't, until this paper, we didn't have any concrete attack, but basically we know this is not a very good idea to use this protocol anymore. However, still, in the end of 2018, when I published it, it was about 6% of the internet still use this older and more vulnerable cipher suite class. And we do have much better alternatives that are both more secure and more efficient. However, it was still supported for backward compatibility, which basically mean as a server, I assume that there will always be someone running Windows XP somewhere, and we don't want to use any possible client, so we're still going to support it. And actually, the TLS standard mandates that this cipher suite will still be supported. Okay, so what we did in our paper, we tested then 9 different TLS implementations to try to see if they are vulnerable to different attacks on RSA Key Exchange. And we found that 7 out of them were vulnerable to new cache or microarchitectural type of attacks that attack the padding of the RSA. And we were able to find attacks in different layers of the protocol for a lot of different implementations. This includes implementations by Amazon, Apple, Firefox, Mozilla, and OpenSSL, which is most widely common use open source implementation. And we have the different type of oracles here. M is for Manger, FFT is for Bleichenbacher, and I is interval, but it can also be called Benny Shor. Benny Shor oracle, which is by a paper by Benny from, I think, about somewhere in the 80s. Yeah, somewhere back then. Okay, so let's assume that you're going to believe me that we are able to break this 6% of the connections. And you still can ask me, so what? I told you that this is going to be the older Windows XP machines. They probably have much more severe security issues than the TLS implementation. So we are all aware to security. We update our machines. We use the latest clients. So why should we care? And what we're able to show in the paper is that we can use this vulnerability to again do what we call a man-in-the-middle downgrade attack, and actually cause even modern up-to-date clients to use this RSA Key Exchange and still be vulnerable. And to do it, we needed to find a novel way to parallelize or to speed up the known technique for this type of attacks. And this enables us to break 100% of the connections in the internet as long as the server uses vulnerable implementation. And actually, this can also be done even if the client doesn't even support the RSA Key Exchange option. So there's no way as a client to protect yourself as long as the server provides this backward compatibility. So we'll now try to understand a little bit about how this type of attack works. And the first thing we need to understand is RSA encryption. We're not going to go over it. I'm sure most of you have seen it. We have an RSA modulus. We have a public exponent E that's used for encryption, private exponent D that's used for decryption. And this is nice math. But the question is how we actually use it in real implementations. And there are actually some issues when we try to implement this in practice. And the first issue that we want to show is the following problem. Let's assume that we use the public exponent 3, which was commonly used till recently. Yes, it was used. It's supposed to be secure, basically. Maybe coppersmith or stuff, but it should be OK in large fields. And now we're going to encrypt the number 1,000. And we are aware of the current up-to-date security guidelines, so we're going to use 2048 bit RSA key. Now, the problem is that 1,000 cube is much smaller than the public key that we use from the modulo. And actually, calculating logarithmic over the reals is something that's relatively easy as long as you have a calculator. So this is a problem. And so for this to be secure, we need to make sure that the number we encrypt is actually large enough. Another issue is that let's assume that we're going to encrypt a very small domain. For example, yes/no answers. And this is vulnerable to what we call dictionary attack. We can very easily see that the same value were encrypted over and over again, was repeated. In order to protect against this type of attacks, we need to make sure that the number that we encrypt is random. It should be different each time we encrypt something. And this is solved by, in TLS at least, what we call PKCS number 1 version 1.5 padding scheme. And the way that's implemented in TLS, for example, is that we're going to add an encryption preamble, which is 2 bytes, 0 and 2. Then for randomization, we're going to add at least 8 random bytes that are non-zero value. Then we have a 0 delimiter that can tell us when the plaintext actually starts. And in TLS, we're always going to have 48 bytes of a pre-mastered secret that have a specific TLS structure. OK. Now, in 1998, which is a little bit over 20 years ago, a cryptographer named Bleichenbacher proposed a new adaptive chosen cipher attack that I'm going to explain what it means, that exploits the way that when we decrypt this type of ciphertext, we actually verify that the padding is correct. And the way that this attack works is we're going to have a client that sends some ciphertext to a server. We're going to have the malicious attacker that's going to record this ciphertext. And then he's going to try to use the server as an oracle. And the oracle is going to tell him for specific ciphertext, after it's decrypted, does it start with the bytes 0 and 2 or not? And all of the attacks that I've talked about before, the microarchitectural attacks, all they are used for is to actually create this oracle, to use side channels to leak this information. And now what's going to do, we're going to modify the ciphertext in a specific manner, and we're going to send the modified ciphertext to the server. We're going to learn if the padding is valid or not valid, if it starts with 0, 2 or not. And then we're going to use this information to further manipulate the ciphertext and leak more and more data until in the end we're able to decrypt the ciphertext. So this is a very nice attack. Now, when we do attacks, we usually have a specific goal in mind. And when we attack TLS, our goal, as in many other parts of life, is to get cookies. Actually, we don't care about decrypting TLS handshakes. What we want to get is the TLS cookies. when we log into some kind of server, there's usually some box that we can tick that says, remember me. And then we don't need to re-input the password each time we access this server. And the way that it works is that the server is going to provide a secret key called a cookie, and this is stored in the browser. And in the beginning of each TLS connection, this cookie is sent to the server, and this identifies the browser as the user, and then we can access the data. So if we can steal a cookie from someone, for example, for his Gmail account, we can simply read all of the emails. We don't need to actually decrypt the traffic. OK, so if we want to get cookies when someone is using RSA Key Exchange, the scenario is relatively simple. What we're going to do is we're going to record or sniff the TLS handshake between the client and the server and the first message that is sent by the client. Then we're going to use this Bleichenbacher type of attack to decrypt the pre-mastered secret that is sent by the handshake, and then we're going to use it to decrypt the first TLS message, and we're going to get a cookie. So, for example, let's assume that we have some bank that runs a very secure web server on a cloud platform. We have Mr. Smiley here that wants to connect to the bank account, and we have the cookie monster that sniffs the traffic. What the cookie monster is now going to do is going to try to do this Bleichenbacher type of attack. But we need the microarchitectural side channels, so we also assume that we have our own code running, for example, on another VM on the cloud, but on the same hardware. And this code is able to measure the microarchitectural side channel, and using this information, we're able to retrieve the cookies. The problem with what I mentioned is that it enables us to get the 6% of the cookies, but we want all of them. So I want to use this type of vulnerability for a downgrade attack. And as I mentioned before, this only requires the server to support the RSA Key Exchange. It works on the latest TLS 1.3 standard, which is nice. This is the first attack against this new version of the protocol. But it does require an active man-in-the-middle attack. So we need to be able to block messages from the client, and we're going to send other messages to the server, and we're going to manipulate the handshake. And the question is, can we get a cookie? But there is one little thing, is that when we do this type of attack, we need to finish the attack in under 30 seconds. Because when we open the TLS handshake, after 30 seconds, the client is going to assume something went wrong, going to throw away all of the cryptographic materials and try again. So we need to finish it before that 30-second timeout. And the problem is, for this type of attack, we actually need a very large number of queries. For some type of DOS attack, we might need millions of handshakes, for other less. But in any case, we have only time for about 600 handshakes before everything times out. So I want to try to parallelize this attack. An interesting fact is that many large companies have a lot of servers around the world. For example, if I'm Facebook, I'm going to have servers in the US, and in Europe, and in Asia. This is used to provide large bandwidth and also better latency for the users. And an interesting fact is that most of those companies actually reuse the same certificates or cryptographic keys between the different servers. And this is also true for companies like Amazon, for example, which are the self-central authority, which basically means they can generate their own keys, but they still reuse them. What we're going to do is we're going to try to parallelize the attack across the multiple servers. We're going to use each server as a separate oracle. And there have been a lot of previous work on how to parallelize this attack, so we should be OK. And again, this life is a bit more complex. And the fact is that when I mentioned the adaptive chosen ciphertext, it basically means that we need to get the answer from the server before we are able to generate the next question. And for 2048-bit RSA, we can prove that we need at least, in the best case, when we're most likely, 2048 sequential adaptive queries to the server. And we only have time for 600. So this attack can't work.
You need this then to break to factor n cookie?
No, I don't factor n. I retrieve the plaintext. All of those attacks do not break the basic security of the keys. They just give me the plaintext, which is probably good enough for an attacker. OK, so we can't. And the problem is that after 30 seconds, I can still recover this plaintext, but this plaintext would, or these keys, were not going to be used by anything because the TLS handshake was aborted, and the first message was not sent. OK, so to try to understand how this attack works, I'm going to show you a variant of the Bleichenbacher attack called the Manger oracle. for some reason other than Benny, they're all German. And in this oracle, what we're going to do is we're going to get a ciphertext, and we're going to learn if the first byte of the decrypted plaintext starts with 0 or not. And now for attack, we're going to use an interesting property of RSA, which means that RSA is a malleable encryption. And what it means that if I take any number s and I raise it to the public exponent e, after multiplying with the ciphertext, the decryption of this is going to be m times s. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do what we call the blinding phase. We're going to generate random s values, and we're going to test when the first time the Manger oracle returns 1. And then what we know is that this m times s is in some smaller part of the space that's possible, a smaller search space. If the possible values are between 0 and n minus 1, we're going to leave part of it out. This is logarithmic scale, by the way. And now what we're going to do in this type of attacks, we can iteratively continue to reduce the search space. And in Manger, basically, each query that we have reduces the search space by half. So we're going to continue doing this calculation. And in the end, if we have 2048 sequential queries, we're able to find a search space of 1. We're able to find the plaintext. However, if we have 600 sequential queries, we're left with a search space of about 1400 bits, which is something that's not very useful for anything. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to assume that we run this several attacks like this in parallel, each attack using a completely different random S values, random blinding value. And now what we saw is that this is actually very similar to a very well-known hidden number problem that was previously used to try to break discrete log-based encryption. And to summarize what it means is basically we can reduce the problem of finding M to the closest vector problem on a lattice. And in this size of lattice, it's very easy to embed it and solve it with LLL. And what we can show is that we need about 5 servers to decrypt the 2048 RSA key using this Manger oracle, all in under 30 seconds. And then we can get the cookie. So when we look at the general scenario, we have a very similar scenario, but now we also have several other servers that we can take in parallel. We're going to put the recovery information in a lattice, and we're going to get the cookies. OK, to summarize the result, we were able to show different techniques, microarchitectural type of techniques to actually allow us to get this type of oracles. We were able to show a new parallelization technique that enabled us to do this downgrade attack. And in the end, again, we have a long and, in this time, relatively complex and not very nice disclosure process with a lot of different companies. In the end, we were able to get them all to patch their code. And we have a lot of different recommendations in the paper how to implement this type of RSA Key Exchange more securely. But the bottom line is, don't do it. This is something that's very, very complex to do correctly. You should deprecate this cipher suite. And if you really, really, really must do it for some reason, it's very important, as in many other cases in cryptography, to separate the different certificates or different keys. We should use different keys between different servers and also between different versions of the protocol. If we use different certificates for TLS 1.3 and TLS 1.2, TLS 1.3 won't be vulnerable anymore. OK, so I think we don't have enough time to go on the last paper. It's a nice paper. We have light bulbs, we have hardware, we have side channels, and we have a bit of crypto. But in the end, the conclusions that I want to have out of this talk is that abstracting crypto is something that's very useful. It's very important, but it also might be dangerous. And we need to really look at how the cryptography is actually implemented, not only how it is designed. And that side channels are not some bugs in the implementation. It's not a problem for the designer, although a lot of people sometimes think. This is a problem in the cryptographic design. And sometimes even small changes in the cryptographic design can make it much more resilient to this type of side channels and much less vulnerable. And we are able to, first of all, use different cryptoanalytic techniques to try to actually use this side channel to achieve something useful for an attacker. And we can use it to actually understand what is the real security guarantees that we can actually get in practice. And this we learn out of it how to motivate new problems to have much better solutions. For example, this work on Wi-Fi motivated current work. with Shachar Pazir on a much better password authenticated key exchange. It's much more suitable for the Wi-Fi type of scenarios and other password protecting schemes. And I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So if you don't like the layer design, so what would be good abstraction, or just say there is no abstraction?
I don't like it. I still use it. For example, in the paper for what we're writing on a new password, we use this type of abstraction, because without it, we'll be much worse. But we need to be aware of this type of sections, and we need to try to have better methodology that we're currently lacking, how to model this type of attacks, and then maybe we can be better designers. But there are no current very good solutions that I'm aware of. This is yes.
בגלל שלא משתמשים, בכל זאת היה הרבה מאמץ גם בתיאוריה ויותר אפליי קריפטוגרפי לממש פרוטוקולים או הצפנות שעמידות לסייט שעמיד אותם.
אז יש דברים, ולדוגמה, כל מיני דברים שעושים דיפלמן הם יותר בטוחים מאשר דברים כמו RSA Key Exchange. יש שתי בעיות, אחד שזה לא תמיד מתאים, לא תמיד קל להשתמש בזה, ושתיים שלפעמים אתה צריך לתמוך בדוגמה של backward compatibility, ולפעמים יש פתרונות חדשים שהולכים היום שהדברים שאנחנו יודעים לא מספיקים. לא יודע, אני לא יודע אם דוגמאות טובות אולי, אבל נלך לעולם של MPC ו-Full Homomorphic Encryption, זה שם דברים שנגיד שהם by design resilient לסייט שלנו, ויש דברים שהם by design לא, ויכול להיות מאוד מסובך להגן בפניהם. זה המצב.
שאלות?